Mr. Secretary, thank you for the time, first of all. When you look back to 2003, do you think that the current wave of change in the Arab world is in any way related to what the United States did in Iraq in 2003?
I don't know. I couldn't prove it either way. I think that there are people who believe that, and there are people who see an evolving democracy in Iraq, in that part of the world, and the end of a dictatorship as a good thing. How someone can draw a string from that to something else in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt, I think only time will tell, and we'll see what the motivation was. I think that on the one hand it's exciting and encouraging to see people in that part of the world reaching out for a better life, seeking freer political and freer economic institutions. And I hope that when it settles down, that's what they'll have, and they just won't have a dictatorship that's different than some of the leadership that, for example, in Libya that existed with Gaddafi and to some extent still does.
What do you make of what's going on now in Syria?
Oh, I think that that's a particularly tough regime, and I think that they are brutally repressing the uprising that has taken place there. His predecessor, his father, of course, in Hama, had killed an awful lot of people back in his time, and my understanding from reading the press is that a lot of people are being killed in that area and others at the present time by the regime. I'm uncomfortable with the Iranian regime and the Syrian regime, and wish that the people of those countries, proud countries with interesting histories, would have the kinds of opportunities that they see other countries providing for their people, and they don't have it, and it's unfortunate. And I would be delighted to see the regimes in those two countries not be there.
Now, the part of the book that deals essentially with Iraq and Iraq-related issues, when I was reading that part, I couldn't help that feeling that on the one hand you were trying to explain on some level what went wrong in Iraq, but I couldn't also help feeling that you were trying to justify some of the decisions that you either made or that people thought that you made with regard to the invasion of 2003. Is that a correct reading?
No, it's as I indicated. What I wanted to do was to take the documentation that existed from that period, the memos that I sent to the President and to people in the Department of Defense and to the members of the National Security Council, and have that record available for people, and particularly historians and people who were seriously interested in that period of time, and just lay out what took place. And there it is. It's there for everyone to see. And some of it is things that went well, and some of it are things that might have been done differently. And that's always true in life, I think.
I mean, without trying to be too provocative, there are probably more people who are critical of the outcome of Iraq than otherwise, at least in my experience. I haven't met a lot of people who, in light of what continues to be the situation in Iraq, look back over these years since 2003 and say, Donald Rumsfeld and co. did a wonderful job in Iraq. How do you react to that?
Well, war is an uncertain thing, and no one can predict its length, the cost, or the number of people who will be lost. And it's the failure of diplomacy, and it is because it's so uncertain. It seems to me, if you look at almost any conflict, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, you'll find the same kinds of concerns. That the enemy has a brain, they adapt and adjust, and as Dwight Eisenhower said, that planning is important, but the plan is nothing, because the plan gets thrown out with first contact with the enemy. And there's no question but that the length of time Iraq has taken, and also Afghanistan, are things that people talk about and are concerned about. I personally don't feel that the United States has the ability to do nation building as such. I think that the cultures are so different, the histories, the neighbors are different. In the case of Iraq, I personally think the world's a better place without Saddam Hussein. I think the fact that Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program after seeing what happened to Saddam Hussein was a good thing. I think the fact that you have a government there, the Constitution they drafted, and a government that is reasonably respectful of all the diverse elements in the country, that's not likely to thumb its nose at the United Nations as it hid. It's not likely to be giving $25,000 to suicide bombers' families if they blow themselves up, killing innocent men, women, and children. Now, are there disadvantages? You bet. So in any situation like that, it seems to me there are pluses and minuses.
Mr. Rumsfeld, just as a follow-up to what you said the world is a better place without Saddam. And surely...
It was a brutal regime.
Surely there are people who may agree with you there, but do you think that the families, Iraqi families, in their tens of thousands who've lost relatives, civilians, they weren't members of Al-Qaeda, or they were just caught in the crossfire, or they were killed by American firepower, do you think honestly that they share this assessment? Do you think that they give a damn whether the world is a better place? They know they're not better off because they've lost loved ones.
Well, on the other hand, the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed by Saddam Hussein's regimes, the mass burial grounds, the people that, the Iraqi people that where Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against them, I think quite the contrary. They would feel very much the way I've expressed. So I'm sure there are people both sides of any issue. That's the way the world works. But there is no doubt in my mind but that the world is a better place. The people of Iraq are better off. Their economy's growing, the schools are open, they don't have a dictatorial government, a brutal government that's repressing the people. And sure, there are going to be people who don't agree with that, and that's fine. But I think objective people have to.
Now, I think there are very few people who disagree over the issue of how much of a thoroughly nasty person Saddam was. And as you pointed out, he killed his own people prior to 2003.
By the hundreds of thousands.
Right, but after beginning 2003, the estimates are obviously vary from one source to source, but it's safe to say that tens of thousands of Iraqis have been killed. My question to you is, two wrongs do not make a right. If Iraqis were killed by Saddam before 2003, Iraqis were killed by coalition forces and others after 2003, that doesn't make it okay, does it?
Well, the loss of an innocent life ever is not okay. But the construct of your question, I think, misses the central point.
Which is?
The central point is that this was a brutal regime that used chemical weapons against his own people and his neighbors, that had invaded Kuwait, that was brutally killing large numbers of its own people and using chemical weapons against them.
By incidentally, weapons that your government had supplied to that regime at various times. You actually you met Saddam in the 80s.
That
you
is
shook
false.
hands with him.
That is false.
No chemical weapons were sold to Saddam?
Not to my knowledge, and certainly not by me or not by the Reagan administration. And any suggestion to the contrary is inaccurate.
But you went to Baghdad, you shook hands with that thoroughly nasty man, and you supported him against the Iranians in his war against the Iranians.
I did not.
So why was he bad
You
then?
should listen. You're posing a question, and you should listen to the response.
Go ahead.
The response is this. President Reagan and Secretary of State Schultz asked me to go to Iraq and meet with Saddam Hussein. Why? Because he was a nice man? No. But because our relationship with Iran was worse. They had taken prisoners, hostages from our embassy, and the relationship there was a bad one. Your suggestion that administration or I had anything to do with supplying chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein is just beyond the pale. It is just so false and so inaccurate.
Let me ask you this, just to make it accurate, Mr. Rumsfeld. Has the United States,
You need to learn to listen.
No, I will listen. I will give you a chance.
You do need to learn to
listen.
listen.
Has the United States at any one time
I have no idea.
supplied weapons or support to Saddam Hussein before 2003? The answer
Not
is
while
yes, it
I
did.
was in government.
Okay, but I'm asking you a general question. Has your country...
You are asserting that, and I'm not in a position to deny it or validate it.
So I'll take that as a validation. If you
don't, you can't. You'd like to, but you can't, because I am without knowledge.
Okay, fine.
It's rare when someone says that.
Okay.
It has the benefit of being true.
It doesn't, not to me, because if you're not validating, you're not denying. As a journalist, you're leaving that open for me to interpret. And based on what
you want to interpret it a certain way, obviously.
I don't want anything.
I mean, you're all cocked and ready.
I just want you, as the former Secretary of Defense, to give me facts that validate or deny categorically what your country has done.
I was in business in the 1980s, and I was asked to take a period of months and be special envoy to the Middle East for President Reagan, and I did. And what took place before or after the period of 4, 5, 6 months that I was involved, others, you'd have to ask others, but you can't draw any conclusions from my lack of knowledge.
Okay, fair enough. Now, weapons of mass destruction, and you say this in your book, you say that, initially there was talk about going into Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. The weapons of mass destruction, when it began to be clear that it wasn't going to be easy to find them, then the narrative changed to human rights and democracy. How convinced were you at the time that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before 2003?
Well, I wasn't in the intelligence business, but I was persuaded, the president was persuaded, Colin Powell made the presentation to the world through the United Nations. He had more experience dealing with intelligence matters than anyone in the administration, including the director of CIA. He was convinced. He spent days preparing that. The director of CIA was absolutely convinced that the intelligence was as good as it can be. It's never perfect, we know that. The other thing I should say is that so were the Democrats in Congress that looked at the information, same information, and so were foreign nations' intelligence agencies and governments. UK, Germany. There was broad agreement, and the UN was aware that Saddam Hussein had rejected some 17 resolutions and refused to cooperate with the inspectors of weapons of mass destruction. So there was broad agreement, and certainly I, as well as everyone I've described, believed that was the case. And it turned out it was, in large measure, if you think about it. Delfer, the man who went in afterwards, he found the people who were still together, who did chemical and biological, and the people who did nuclear weapons. They found the facilities that could do dual use, chemical and biological, both civilian purposes as well as military. And they found precursors. And up in Kermal, they actually found the toxins and the protective suits and the Arabic documents that showed how to make chemical and biological.
But you cannot...
But not big stockpiles.
Right. But you cannot ascertain with certainty after the fact that there were weapons of mass destruction that justified the invasion of Iraq and getting rid of, by the way, a thoroughly nasty man. But that's not the issue here. Were there weapons of mass destruction? Did they ever turn up in any way that suggested to you deep down that the invasion was worth carrying out?
I think the invasion was worth carrying out. It was a calculation the president made based on the intelligence that everyone looked at and believed, and the speech and presentation that Colin Powell made to the United Nations.
But no weapons of mass destruction have turned up.
Oh, they did. At Kermal, they found the toxins on the floor in the basement of sub floors of that facility.
But is
no
that,
stockpiles?
Is no stockpiles?
Right, exactly.
Now, would you be willing, in any shape or form, to tell the Iraqis we invaded Iraq, we got rid of a thoroughly nasty man who tormented you, whom we had helped at various times in different ways, but I want to apologize to you as Iraqis for the casualties that you have sustained since 2003, since no weapons of mass destruction have taken.
You want to be the person interviewed instead of the interviewer.
No, I am
Yes,
the
I'm going to respond to you.
interviewer.
You've had a long time now. You sit back and listen.
Give me something to listen to. I asked you a question. Would you apologize to the Iraqis?
I've heard the question 3 times, and the answer is of course not. The president made a decision that at the time was the right decision. It made sense. It was based on the best information available. And the people of Iraq today are vastly better off than they were then. Now, does everyone regret the loss of life on both sides? You bet.
How many people do you think have been killed in Iraq since 2000?
I'm not going to get into that. How many people were killed before 2003?
Well, you said it. You said hundreds of thousands. So we've established
You've
that.
seen the killing fields. They were terrible.
Fine. I mean, no one is arguing about that. I'm asking you about how, as the former Secretary of Defense, who was Secretary of Defense when Iraq was invaded, are you in a position to tell me how many Iraqis, up until at least the time you stopped being a member of the administration, were killed in Iraq?
Yeah, one doesn't know, but if you think of what the insurgents did, where they chopped off people's heads, not American soldiers, but Iraqi insurgents and foreign insurgents in that country, Al-Qaeda and others, jihadists, chopped off people's heads, dragged people through the street, walked into markets with suicide vests on and killed large numbers of people. How many people did they kill? I don't know. Nobody knows, but they killed a lot of people.
Now, to what extent...
And the value they put on human life is very different from the value Americans put on human life.
And we're not talking about Americans, we're talking about the Bush administration here. To what extent do you think that those criminals that you've just talked about and the policies that your administration at that time pursued in Iraq were equally responsible for the killing of innocent Iraqis because, for example, you did not secure the borders of Iraq going into Iraq with 130,000, 140,000, which many people in the Pentagon at the time told you was not enough.
You keep making assertions which are fundamentally false. There was no one in the Pentagon said they were not enough. The president went around the room. He asked every one of them, do you have everything you need? Do you have the numbers you want? We went back and forth with the commanders in Iraq and at CENTCOM asking them, do they want additional forces? And the answer was no. And every time they wanted them, when it was yes, they were increased.
Okay, so does that make the numbers right? Does that make the numbers you went into Iraq with right?
Do you want to yell or do you want to have an interview? You have a choice. You have a choice. You're being true to form.
No, but
yes, you are.
Asking
no,
you,
say yes
Secretary,
once. Just say yes
once. I'm asking you. Do you think that the numbers you went into Iraq, the numbers of US troops that you went into Iraq with, did absolve you from the responsibility of tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis killed by the coalition and those criminals that you talked about?
Now, are you going to stop?
Give me a straight answer.
Look, you can characterize my answers any way you want, and you do it in a pejorative way.
No, I'll do it respectfully.
No, you don't at all. You're obviously you are of that nature. It's clear that's your being that you like to do that.
No, I'm asking you respectfully for facts.
No, you're not.
I mean, don't talk about that.
You're not being respectful. You're just talking over and over and over
well,
and repeating yourself.
You have just disparaged me as a member of Al Jazeera, but that's okay. Just give me a straight answer.
How did I disparage you? I said you're not being respectful. You're just talking over and over and over, and that's what you're doing.
Okay, I'll listen.
Anyone listening to this program can see that.
Okay, give me
that's
a straight
what you
answer,
do.
Mr. Secretary.
You know, I listen to you and I think to myself,
this is not about me, Mr. Secretary. This is about me
asking you
a question.
You're not going to listen.
You're not giving me an answer to my question. If you want to attack me personally, fine. But give me an answer to my question.
Why should I do everything you want and you won't do a thing I want, namely listen?
Interviewer.
Oh, really? And that gives you the privilege to be the way you are?
Seriously, just give me an
answer
to my question.
What do you mean seriously? I'm being serious.
Okay.
This is worthless. This is not an interview. You're haranguing. That's what you're doing.
I'm listening to you. Just give me an answer.
Well, no, my goodness, we've had a sudden change. Isn't that amazing? I suppose you're going to drop all this on the cutting room floor. That's
Yes,
what you do with it, I suppose, if you don't like it. Now, give me your question in a neutral way, just once.
My question is, do you think you criticized the criminals, and I don't think there's any disagreement there that a lot of innocent people were killed by Al-Qaeda and the jihadists and others. There's no disagreement about that. My question to you is, to what extent do you think that...
Okay, I'll answer you.
That your approach
to
the invasion...
Yeah, I remember the question now. Mm-hmm. First of all, you said that I was told over and over again by people to increase the number of troops, and I pointed out that that's factually not true. That the President and I and the people involved asked the commanders over and over again how many troops did they need, and they got every single troop they asked for. Was it the right number is, I think, part of your question, buried in there somewhere. And the answer is, it probably was for much of the time. There's no way you can secure the borders. We can't secure the borders in the United States of America. You've been listening to the debates. Borders are not securable. They're porous. And you have neighbors like Syria, and you have neighbors like Iran, and people were pouring in from different other countries. And the Iraqis tried to stop them, the Iraqi security forces. We tried to stop them to the extent you could, but it's not possible. It's not. You could have put in 4 times the numbers of people. And what would have happened? You would have been charged with occupying the country to take their oil and all of this propaganda that the other side was promoting. And these implications that by a few more troops you could have sealed those borders, I think, is factually inaccurate.
Well, I mean, we're not talking about a few more troops. We're talking about the difference between 130,000, 140,000,
wouldn't have made any
450,000.
Yeah.
If you had deployed a larger number of troops and tried to secure the border, even decreasing the toll among Iraqi civilians, even by 1,000, don't you think that would have been worth it?
They did try to, we did increase the number of troops, and they did try to secure the borders, and they did provide a great amount of money to the Iraqi security forces to organize them and train them and equip them, and border patrols to have them do it. We sought help from other neighboring countries to assist as well.
But I mean, the fact that you only had about 130, 140,000, you had as you say, these wide borders that went mostly unprotected. You knew, for example, the Syrians didn't want you in Iraq. The Iranians didn't want you in Iraq. Did you at any time during the preparations think that if we go in with this number, we're leaving ourselves and the Iraqis wide open for foreign interference in Iraq?
There were extensive discussions by the military planners on that subject. And the conclusion they came to was that the number of troops that went in was what they believed was appropriate.
How about you? Did you think that was the right?
I certainly agreed with what the military commanders recommended, yes.
How do you feel when people go around with regard to what happened in Iraq saying Donald Rumsfeld should be held accountable before a criminal court?
Well, I mean, the president made a decision. I was the Secretary of Defense. We executed the decision in the best way we could. And it was consistent with our U.S. policies. It had been the policy of our government during the Clinton administration. The Congress had passed regime change legislation during that period, and President Clinton had signed it.
Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.